Next Radio with Broadcast Bionics. Innovative solutions for creative people.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. My name is Alan, and I work on the product team at 7 Digital. For those who don't know, 7 Digital is a music technology company, and our platform has powered hundreds of music services over the past 11 years since we were founded, delivering lots of different listening experiences. We've actually structured our product team around those listening experiences, and today we have a product owner for streaming, responsible for the technology that supports our streaming services. We have a product owner for downloads, responsible for our own download service, 7digital.com, and also some of our new initiatives around HD music. We have a product owner for radio, who's responsible for our software roadmap for this industry, and we have a product owner for data, and that's me. And it's my remit at 7 Digital to take a look at the data that comes from our platform and the data that's available in the broader ecosystem to try and make use of it and try and help create a data-driven decision-making culture in our organization, but also in our industry. Today I'm going to talk about how we see the value in that data, but also some of the disciplined processes that we try and adopt in becoming data-driven in our decision-making. One of the questions you will hear asked at 7 Digital on a regular basis, and even more regular on the product team, is this question here. How different do you think our listening experience will be in the next 10 years? It's certainly a very interesting question to consider how somebody might have answered that 10 years ago. What would they have said, and how would that compare to the real world as we see it today? One thing is for sure, today in 2015, the listener is better served. Never before has humanity listened to so much music at a given point in time. The listener has more choice, and they have more access. But what does that mean for the next 10 years? I think for us as an industry, it means things are going to be competitive and are going to remain competitive because if the pace of technology continues to disrupt our industry, that competitiveness isn't going to get any easier. But one thing we do have today that we didn't have 10 years ago, in 2005, is an ability to consume and digest ever-growing quantities of data. And we see that as our competitive advantage, not necessarily to determine what we're going to do next, but certainly to monitor the performance of the new initiatives we have around building innovative listening experiences for the future. As a product owner responsible for building listening experiences, you develop a mindset composed of two parts. The first part is, who are my market, and how do I build an experience that everybody in that market is going to want to use? And the second part is, how do I keep them using it? How do I keep them engaged? In other words, reach and engagement. And from a software perspective, which is my background, there is no better example of service and technology coming together and maintaining such levels of reach and engagement for so long as the actual radio industry. We certainly see we have a lot to learn from this industry on the software side of things. But the great thing about these two metrics, reach and engagement, is that they're individual data points. And you can plot them on a chart like this. Of course, the sweet spot of success is the top right-hand corner, where you've built a service that everybody is using and everybody's remaining engaged. But you don't start out here. And if you have success at getting here, there's no guarantee you're going to stay in this sweet spot of success for very long. But if, like me, you're more interested in the journey rather than that destination, knowing the trajectory that you take towards your sweet spot of success can be critically important at informing the nature of the ideas that you're going to build into your strategy. For example, consider a service that has great reach, but the people don't engage. If you can track this in real time, this can inform your strategy to create ideas that are a more engaging or more immersive experience, to try and get a better trajectory towards your sweet spot. Similarly, consider a service that very few people use, but the very few people who use it are highly engaged. How could you use that kind of information in creating your roadmap of innovation as you enhance your listening experience? If this was your scenario, well, you should be building opportunities that are more viral in nature to try and extend that reach towards your sweet spot. Of course, where you don't want to go is the danger zone. And if you start off here, you want to validate your ideas quickly to make sure they're going to bring you out of here. Oftentimes, when you talk about the importance of a data-driven decision-making culture, it can conflict with the notion of a creative culture in an organization. So how does this hardline, data-driven approach impact the creative culture that you might have or that you would find in radio stations? Well, at 7 Digital, we don't see it as creativity versus data. We see them both being integral components to the organization. And in fact, Spotify, in a recent Wired article, said this very well. They say that playlists are made by people, but they live and die by data. That's particularly poignant as we take a look back over the past 10 years. Some of the most successful music services are human-curated services. But that's not to say that every single playlist created by a person is good. You can measure the performance of them, and data is your key differentiator. At 7 Digital, we believe the new status quo is that success will follow those who are most creative, and that's imperative, that doesn't change, but also who are the most informed. And a good metric of success is, can you articulate that? Can you articulate the desire of your listeners? This notion of measuring radio in much the same way you would a software product isn't new thinking in the world of software. Over the past 10, 15 years, this way of thinking has matured and can be largely attributed to the success of some of the most successful companies in the internet economy. And interestingly, it has a name. It's known as lean thinking. And it's based on a principle with 3 components that you can build, measure, and learn all of your ideas. Those 3 components form a feedback loop in this direction. For example, consider some of the ideas you have now that you might try to innovate. It is a fact to say that some of those ideas will perform better than others once they're executed. And the lean approach will inform you to prioritize your ideas based on your ability to measure their impact. In fact, it goes one step further. If you have ideas where you cannot measure their impact, you should be careful at implementing those, otherwise you're taking a shot in the dark. But consider an idea you have and you're able to measure it. During execution of the idea, measure your listener's reaction, gather the data. And critically important, the final stage is analyze that data. Decide whether it had the positive impact you were looking for, and if it has, continue with the idea, preserve it. But if it hasn't, pivot away from the idea. Organizations that can follow this kind of feedback loop will naturally, over time, create a creativity culture in the organization where you can pour fuel on the fire of good ideas and cold water on the ideas, even though at first might have seemed good but didn't deliver the results. Some software companies, and particularly the larger internet companies, measure the speed at which they can iterate through this loop as a key performance indicator. Because a quick feedback loop means accelerated learning. The speed at which you can get through this loop on implementing your ideas, collecting the data and analyzing them will determine how informed you are staying on your listeners' preferences when they tune into your service. Of course, there is much more to radio data than just reach and engagement metrics. And the question is, when the data sets get complex, how do you know you're relying on the right data? What defines good data? At 7 Digital, we informally describe good data as being useful to lots of people in the organization, requires very little knowledge to understand it and make sense of it, and critically, is available at the point of a decision being made. If you're going to have a data strategy in your organizations, make sure you democratize your data. Make it available from everybody to the CEO to the temporary analyst who joins for the summer school program. Because if you can, everybody becomes part of your feedback loop. Everybody can validate their own ideas and hypotheses that they have on innovation. But when the data sets do get complex, what helps in the adoption of that data is making sure your data has context. To help with this at 7 Digital, we developed what we call the Music Data Context Map. And it's based on the premise that any listening experience has got 3 integral components. Music, which extends to content in the context of radio, audience, which can also be measured, and service, which can be measured too. For example, take some of the dimensions you could measure on the music that you broadcast. Already you may know that recurrence always perform well, or that if you promote your favorite track on an album of one of the artists that you like, your listeners are going to respond well to that. But what about the real-time social sentiment your listeners have with the same artists on social media? Or what about the new metadata that's now available in music catalogs? Beyond just mood and genre, what about the acoustic properties of the music that you broadcast? How danceable is the music that you broadcast on your service? Or, knowing that some of your listeners tune in while at work, how conducive is your broadcast to a productive work environment? With audience data, I think UK radio is particularly well able to articulate their demographic. They know the gender, the age, and the taste profiles of their listeners. But what about the deeper location data? Beyond just knowing that people tune in for the rush hour commute or while they're going home, what would it mean to you if you knew that some of your listeners went out running, and every time they did, they tuned into your service? Or that they were doing the housework? What would that mean? Perhaps some of the richest audience data is the behavioral data. Why did somebody decide to tune into your service? But more importantly, why did they mute you? Or why did they decide to try and skip to another service? One of the metrics we capture across our platform is what we call the music bounce rate, the point at which someone stops listening to a track. Almost 35% of songs on subscription music streaming services end before the first 30 seconds of play. Why is that the case? Well, we're hypothesizing the reasons why, and one of the hypotheses is that users are becoming more fickle. Listeners are more fickle in the world of abundant choice. They haven't got the same sense of loyalty to a music collection that they once would have had to build. And they hunt for that perfect song and hit skip much more frequently than they ever would have done before. But what do these changes in listener behavior mean for UK radio? Of course, service data. From a software perspective, this is where we see we have the most to learn from radio. One of the metrics at 7 Digital that we say we will live and die by is what we describe as our time to first play. So the analogy here is on the tabletop radio device with such a high degree of certainty and probability, when I turn the radio tuner to that frequency, I know I'm going to hear your voice or I'm going to hear the music that you're broadcasting. But how does that kind of magical experience translate to a software version of your app? How long does it take from when the listener presses play in a mobile app until they hear your broadcast? Taking a look at UK radio data, I think it's fair to say collectively as an industry, it's still in that sweet spot. Looking at the radar data, UK radio at an industry is still at ubiquitous levels and really competitive levels of engagement. In fact, on a per territory basis, any of the individual leading digital internet services over the past 10 years, while they're now competing on levels of engagement, they haven't competed on levels of reach. AudienceNet provide a really interesting classification for how they measure competition on share of the year. And they have 3 classifications. Self-selected services, where you select your own music, like a Spotify streaming music, where the listener picks their own tunes. Curated experiences, where there is a human deciding what the listener will listen to, and radio is classified in that classification. And the lean-back listening experiences, where there is no or limited interactivity, a Pandora-like service. And in the share of the year analysis, the question is, how are these numbers going to change over the next 10 years? What are they going to look like? Well, we can wait and look back with the benefit of hindsight and see what impacts these numbers, but we're at a really interesting point because Pandora, which arguably is one of the most successful digital music services over the past 10 years in the internet category, has been successful in a different market where we haven't seen that same level of success here. If you look at the same figures in the USA, where Pandora has a reach of almost 80 million people, what's interesting is the competition is greatest between the lean-back category and the self-selected services, underpinning the need of the listener to have experiences where the music delivered to them is selected by a human. When we go back to the opening question, how different do you think our listening experience will be in the next 10 years? 7 Digital would strongly encourage you to set the highest demands and expectations on your software and technology partners. Ask them the hard questions and make sure they're serving you the data you need to answer them, because software systems can do that. And use that data to stay informed by speeding up your feedback loop. Thank you.